dear friends. Thank you first very much to the organizing committee with Steve Ben as the scientific chair for having me on stage. Here it's of course as a Swiss, still Swiss, always a great pleasure to come back to this beautiful country. And Geneva is certainly one of the highlights. We haven't enjoyed as much from the eastern part of Switzerland, where it was the longest distance that you can travel in Switzerland, about 270 miles. I'm now at Tufts and bring you greetings from Boston, where finally spring has settled in and you probably start seeing the boats in the water of Boston Harbor. And this is the school I'm working at. Tufts School of Dental Medicine is one of the larger dental schools in the United States, with a student body of 180 pre-doctoral students a year. So there's obviously a big crowd in this big building at all times. We're actually hosting, if I can advertise a little bit, an education week at Tufts. We're also a scholarship center. Work a lot together with Harvard. We have seen Dr. Gallucci yesterday, and together we have the ITI Education Week in Boston in June. And if anybody is interested, you'll certainly find the information at the ITI booth. My topic is to talk about technical complications, which, as Professor Heis Mayfield told you, are hardware complications. And they are a nuisance and regular occurrence in practice. For those, and I remember I was young once, starting with dental implants, one is very excited, but the longer you practice, the more those patients come in with issues which fortunately mostly can be resolved, but they ask your time, your talent, your innovative skill, and of course also the patience. The technical complications, unfortunately, as years go by, in larger cases go along often with other issues in that patient's dentition, where one would have to say whoever did the treatment at the time did not comprehensively address how this patient should be looked at, as Dr. Morton just told you, looking at a patient's compliance and willingness and interest in what you are going to build with those expensive implant restorations in the mouth, and not just enjoying the fiduciary side of outcomes. So, as Salvi and Brecker have defined in their paper in 2009, which was the result of an ITI consensus conference, mechanical risks are those related to prefabricated components, implants, implant abutments, implant screws, where the technical risks or the technical complications are those which really have to do with the prosthesis we or our technicians make in the lab. Some examples of mechanical complications you see in this slide, going from implant fracture to abutment screw fracture to abutment fracture itself, and we see a bit more of that with the use of new materials if they are not critically assessed or used with a certain careful approach. And of course then also prosthetic screw fractures, and I discussed a bit where the reasons for those come from. And then for technical complications, primarily the veneer fracture in the middle is the biggest headache we have. Plus the porcelain chipping, which of course if it is a large prosthesis like this full arch situation, is a nuisance. It's hard to repair. You have to take it out. You probably have to take all the porcelain off, all the ceramic off, and restart building it. So a major enterprise. And then you also have the framework fractures, which are really an issue where, in this case, the technician, but as dentists, we also have a responsibility to look at framework designs at the time of trying, where a frame has been undersized. Causes for hardware complications are multiple. They have to do with the implant per se, the parts per se, obviously manufacturer side, but a lot, of course, with us dentists and with our technicians who not always like to follow manufacturer's instructions. And we have seen that a bit with zirconia veneering where maybe the technology or the use in the lab was too similar to what I has been doing with force-induced to metals, so temperature cycles were not observed accurately and problems that way occur. But on our side, as dentists, as Dr. Morton already showed, the selection of the implant has to follow a prosthodontic plan. And then, of course, you have today, thanks to better materials, the opportunity to maybe reduce the size of the implant if required in a given site. But you have to always look at this comprehensively. And as I mentioned before, many patients who come in with implant problems, they also have a lot of other dental problems who probably were probably not addressed at the time of implant placement. And unfortunately, if you are in a prosthodontic practice and the so-called specialist, you inherit quite a few of those patients. A great paper based on a lot of work was published in 2003 by Charles Goodacre, former dean at Loma Linda, and he did a comprehensive analysis with his co-workers on complications relative to implant prosthesis. And this slide shows you implant loss as being primarily related, or in terms of numbers, statistical numbers, strongly related to maxilla and removable prosthesis, which probably has nothing to do with overdenture being wrong, but the way we had placed implants at the time, trying to rescue a situation where a patient really had a hard time functioning with the denture in a result of real bridge. So implants were placed wherever you could, at whatever angles you could, and therefore not favoring implant long-term stability. And this is a case I received from Dr. Krause. Alex Krause is a great friend from Athens, Greece, and the faculty at Tufts, who has actually a whole collection on implant fractures. These implants are not in use anymore, but the patient like that who had them for a long time might tomorrow come in your practice, and obviously a major headache. What you also see here is that the maxilla tends to offer higher risks for complications than in the mandible in terms of implant loss. Those numbers are coming down. I'll show you some information shortly. Implant fracture, fortunately, is a very low incidence of about 1%. Implant prosthetic complications, now really looking at the top, those over 10% incidence, you can see here again, overdenture loss of retention, aesthetic veneer fractures, overdenture reline, overdenture clip attachment fracture, overdenture removable prosthesis on implants tends to have a higher risk of or number of complications. And then you have a lot of smaller ones, as I mentioned, happening in everyday practice, where they have to spend half an hour to fix a certain problem. In a paper I already mentioned by Gianni Salvi and Urs Brecker, part of the Consensus Conference in 2008 in Stuttgart, they had identified from the literature reviews 10 risks that were sort of generalizable or extractable from a number of patients, and you see them listed here. The overdenture, the retentive element in overdenture, again, being a major issue. And they, after analysis then, could highlight those of the factors identified, out of 10 factors identified, which really correlated with a greater frequency of these complications. And I have them framed for you, and you see the pluses there. I want to use this again to just make a conclusion for you for overdentures, and this is what I sort of want to tell you clinically to observe to reduce the risk. Mechanical and technical risks in the maxilla appear greater. We have seen that, especially with overdentures, so be careful with the design. Avoid spherical anchors. We can say today use either bars if necessary, but today you can easily have CAD-CAM, metal bars, titanium bars. It doesn't have to be expensive gold anymore. Or if you use individual elements, more cylindrical types, such as locators. If you do not have a good or a sizable body of an overdenture, use metal frames, metal reinforcements, and patients with dentures, even if they believe that they do not need any follow-up, they do need follow-up. Oral hygiene, periodontal maintenance or peri-implant tissue maintenance, but also prosthetic maintenance. So if an overdenture over time is not fitting in 100% in the posterior saddle areas, you certainly need to streamline. Here are a couple of examples. Our standard of care, on the left side you see an overdenture case with a complete denture in the maxilla done by one of our residents. I did the surgery with them. 2 implants, locator abutments in the mandible are really giving the patient a comfort of function and an ease of maintenance that those who come in with dentures and do not expect fixed prosthesis are absolutely happy with. On the right side, an older patient I treated back at Harvard about 15 years ago, and she's still functioning. She has now a new denture in the meantime, I understand. And it just shows my philosophy of still using bars in the maxilla, especially when implants are short or diameter reduced, because the bar provides a primary splint, and splinted restorations in the maxilla, if implants are placed correctly and used correctly, have done better. And this is a gold bar. Today I further use a titanium built bar. I want to move then from the removable dentures to now fixed, and first single crowns. This was a great paper by Ronnie Young and co-workers where they looked at survival and complication rates of single crowns, and you see in pink those complications that occur at the higher rate than others. You see the whole list, as we already had heard from Lisa Heitz before. Loose abutments or screws, clearly the highest. Aesthetic complications at that point also relatively high. We have to certainly take, in the planning aspect, excellent care of those, and then the soft tissue complications, also a substantial number, as Dr. Morton has addressed it. In conclusion from that paper, one can always see the positive. Those restorations function very well if we execute planning and treatment well. However, the biological and particularly technical complications are frequent, and we have to live with them and, of course, learn from them. This was an interesting study done by Dr. Papastorilakos, who was an ITI scholar at Harvard at the time, so it's a Harvard paper with Herman Gallucci as main author, or a senior author, and he did a systematic review, on fixed prosthesis in edentulous patients, full arch fixed prosthesis. And you see that cumulative rates of complication-free prosthesis at 5 years was about 30%, at 10 years only 8%. So the longer time goes, the more likely will there be an issue to fix. And the most frequent mechanical complication, implant part, was screw fracture, either prosthetic or abutment screw, at 5 years 10%, and at 10 years 40%. So clearly wear and tear, fatigue, material fatigue, sometimes corrosion, add to that increased frequency. And in conclusion, one could say that technical complications after placement of fixed implant prosthesis occur continuously over time as a result of fatigue and stress. These events may not lead to failure of implants or prosthesis, but they are significant in terms of the amount of repair and maintenance needed, as well as time and cost to both patient and the clinician. I want to use now the results of the ITI Consensus Conference held not too long ago, 2012 in Bern, 2013 in Bern, and you all have, as Dr. Morton already pointed out, the summaries the supplement of IJOMI, International Journal of All Maxillofacial Implants, in your course bags. Whole team, most of them, or probably all of them, of the so-called experts who were invited to participate are here. And I want to use this paper, which I think, or the paper coming out of the group talking about prevention or analyzing prevention and management of technical complications with Bjarne Pettersen and Irina Seiler as the mainstay for you to see where the complications sit, and then also give you hints how to take care of them. The interesting part of this study is that they did systematic reviews, typical inclusion criteria, which studies you take in, which not 5 years was the minimum in terms of follow-up. And they divided them up, they divided the papers up in groups of prior to 2000 year publication and after 2000. And when you look at various potential causes for complications, as we already had heard about them, prosthesis survival overall has improved since then. Cemented post-forward retained prosthesis, especially the screw-retained prosthesis, because manufacturers have provided us with better devices, better implant abutment interfaces, also better occlusive screws or prosthetic screws, to see a dramatic increase there, where single crowns and fixed dental prosthesis in overall survival are very similar. Important is always proper plan and proper design. Very much like a natural teeth, you have to design, and your technician of course with you, the prosthesis correctly. And if you plan also implant placement optimally, then you end up for screw-retained prosthesis, as the image shows, with implants pretty much over the axis of the implants in the center of the restoration. You can keep that access hole relatively small, and it becomes not so much of an occlusal design nuisance as if you are off-center or maybe in a marginal bridge area. The 5-year complication rates from the older studies to the newer studies show overall improvement, with one big exception, and that's the fracture of veneer material. We have to assume, and that was the interpretation of the authors also, that a lot of that worsening has to do with the fact that newer studies report much more diligently on the occurrence of those complications. Whereas in the past, that was not a mainstay of reporting on implant outcomes, whatever the prosthesis was doing. Implant survival was the main thing. What is positive to see is that the aesthetic complications have improved, so they have come down quite a bit. We still have to learn, but I think we have developed protocols, and clinicians start to understand that implant placement in the aesthetic zone especially has to be restoratively driven, with proper observance of the obviously surgical components, such as the presence of bone and soft tissue. The risk of implant fracture is one of the points addressed, and how to avoid them. Implant fractures, as I mentioned, are rare. This is another example Dr. Bruce was kind enough to give me. But the story of this patient is that initially he was dentate in the upper left quadrant. Later on, implants were placed, so the whole occlusion scheme and the resilience changes, and with that new scheme, that implant, the free end-standing implant on the left side, with this extended cantilever bar, was not able to withstand that force and fracture. So when something in the history of in the patient changes in terms of treatment or presence of teeth or restorations, we have to recognize that and react to it by designing the occlusal properly. But implant fracture is a rare complication. Important is to use appropriately designed and manufactured implants with documented low fracture rates. use implants that are made of materials that have been thoroughly tested, and your manufacturer should provide you with that information, and it should be credible information. And place implants according to a prosthodontic plan, as I already said, numerous occasions, stressing how important that is, in an appropriate distribution, number, and diameter. And fortunately, modern technology gives you great tools to do that really prior to executing the treatment. Planning where the teeth need to be, from there then set the implants in the digital planning software, and ultimately, if you want, designing with that, printing or milling guided surgery guides through which you cannot deviate with an implant ending up exactly in the position where you want it. The only caveat is don't do it flapless in cases where you do not have sufficient bone, because otherwise you run into the biological compromises already highlighted by Dr. Morton. Examples of implant fractures, although rare, but if it happens, it's catastrophic. We absolutely hate it in all our patients. Can be iatrogenic. For instance, in dense bone, if you force an implant without pre-tapping too deep, you might not only break an inserting device, you can actually break the head of the implant. Undersized design, this is an example Dr. Taylor, Tom Taylor gave me. Obviously, diameter-reduced implant already had to be a little more careful in its indication or choice of indication. With an impossible cantilever already leaning like the Tower of Pisa, that cannot be looking good. So we have to make the right decisions. And then sometimes a little unfortunate, not always foreseeable, an overload fracture in that implant that simply split after the crown was in and short time in function. Risk of fracture and or loosening of prosthetic grooves. 3 points primarily are culprits here: mishandling, and we all do our things wrong sometimes by not reading manufacturer's guidelines, but that's the only thing I can say. Use authentic products, use tertiary party screws, do not know if they fit exactly the same way. So I think it's important to use really the product that goes with that specific implant. Misfit, assure, passive fit of framework. We learned that in dental school, applies to teeth, it applies to implants. X-rays, radiographs can help, but not always can you detect marginal gaps depending on implant design. The most reliable is using a fit-checking silicone as one example, and that usually really helps you identify where you have areas where the prosthesis is not seating properly. And occlusal forces, bruxism of course, they basically add to the complexity, frequency, or intensity of those technical complications. And if you have a patient like that, and you cannot always identify a bruxer at the outset, provide occlusal guards and convince the patient that it is a good thing in terms of preventing long-term complications. Risk of fracture and or loosening of abutments. Today we have better abutment screws, we have better occlusal screws or prosthetic screws, so if we use those parts according to manufacturers, we have seen that number has come way down. What we see today though is with new materials, better colored materials, a trend to uncritically use, for instance, zirconia abutments when it's really not indicated. And I will tell you, stay away from that. Tom Taylor said it right. Why do you use ceramic abutments in the posterior part of the oral cavity of the dental arch? Use them where you need it. And even as indicated by those two cases, the upper one, you are in the anterior area with a very thick gingival or peri-implant mucosa. Hides everything. Ron Young and Chris Hemmel in Zurich have shown that if your mucosa is 2 millimeters thicker or thicker, you can have titanium underneath, it will not shine through. On the other side, the patient, you see at the bottom, came to me because the right crown on an aeroneck implant, the custom abutment had gotten loose. Needed replacement, and you see that in her case with a relatively thin mucosa, you have that shine through. And we could solve that very nicely with a custom CAD/CAM abutment and a cemented restoration. She has to wait until she has money again to pay for the site number 1, 2 implant. Blister fracture of frameworks and veneering materials, nothing new, just make sure that the frames are designed appropriately with strong enough connectors, and they have to provide a support for the restoration, so the frame should be the minor shape of the final restoration, just allowing for the adequate thickness of the material. And this schematic drawing shows it. Obviously you come from a wax-up, or the technician comes from a wax-up, cuts back the 1 to 2 millimeter thickness for the ceramic material, and with that has a support for the ceramic as it is needed. The areas of thick ceramics are usually those that lead to ceramic fracture. Adjust the occlusion, observe the occlusion in recall visits. It's important because you suddenly might see a high spot on the crown that is implant supported, and that becomes a risk for chipping. And then of course afterwards carefully polish the area, and if you have to deal with large or extended fixed partial benches in patients who tend to have higher crucial forces, again, night guard indicated. Finally, we're to quality assurance. I think we need, it is strongly recommended, we have to recommend to each of us, to our clinicians, technicians as well as manufacturers, to have a tracking system. And if the manufacturer doesn't provide that, larger manufacturers usually do, you owe to yourself or the patient to have the indication, the information on what parts you use, part numbers, lot numbers in the patient's record. We must be aware that not all implant systems have the same level of documentation, so we obviously would like to work with those who have. Clinicians should be aware of the origin of the components used. Big problem today, we have tertiary parts made, CAD/CAM milling by the lab technician. We just do not know if those parts fit as accurately, and it can lead to a wear and tear of the implant abutment interface, ultimately hurting the soft titanium. And we should be aware of these potential inaccuracies, especially in this world where one can have an abutment made cheaper somewhere, but you should know who that somewhere is and what the quality that somewhere will provide. I want to acknowledge those who have kind enough to give me examples to share with you, and I want to thank you, of course, for being here, for your attention. Thank you.